On the afternoon of July 26, 2000, on trading screens from Toronto to New York, one stock closed at just over $124 a share. And when that number settled, something happened that had never happened before to any company in Canadian history and has never happened since. That single stock, on its own, was now worth more than $1 in every 3 invested in the entire Canadian stock market. Not the technology sector, not the telecom sector. The whole country's stock market, every bank, every mining company, every retailer added together, and one company alone made up more than a third of it. If you had a mutual fund in Canada that summer, a pension plan, a retirement account that simply tracked the index the way millions of ordinary people's did without ever thinking twice about it, you owned a piece of this company, whether you had ever heard its name or not. Its name was Nortel Networks, a phone equipment maker that had been quietly wiring Canada together for more than 100 years before anyone called it a technology stock. 9 years after that afternoon in Toronto, it was worth nothing, not diminished, not struggling, nothing. So completely erased that by the end, its single most valuable asset was not a product or a customer or a network. It was the wreckage of its own old ideas, sold off for parts to the highest bidder. This is the story of how one company built the largest position any single stock has ever held inside an entire national economy, using a strategy that felt unstoppable right up until the moment it detonated. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what that strategy was and why the very thing that made Nortel briefly worth more than the rest of Canada combined was also the reason it could not survive losing it. This story does not start in Silicon Valley. It starts in a workshop behind a telephone exchange in Montreal in 1895, where Bell Canada spun off its small manufacturing arm into a company that would spend the next 80 years building the physical guts of the Canadian phone system, the switches, the cables, the equipment nobody ever saw, but everyone used. For most of the 20th century, it was a quiet, profitable, almost boring monopoly supplier, majority owned by Bell itself. In 1976, it renamed itself Northern Telecom and bet everything on fully digital switching equipment years before most competitors did. A bet that worked. By the time a new president took over its executive suite in October 1997, the company had already spent a century learning how to grow slowly and safely. What came next would abandon every lesson from that century in less than 3 years. The new president was named John Roth, and he believed the future of the company was not telephone switches, it was the internet itself, the fiber optic cables and routers that would carry every email, every website, every phone call across the emerging digital world. Rather than build that future piece by piece, Nortel decided to buy it as fast as possible, using the one asset it had in nearly unlimited supply during the dot-com years, its own soaring stock price. On June 15, 1998, Nortel announced it would acquire a networking company called Bay Networks for $9.1 billion, paid almost entirely in stock, the largest telecommunications and data networking deal the industry had ever seen. It kept going. Through 1999 and into early 2000, Nortel bought a company that made customer relationship software, a startup building experimental optical switches, another specializing in long-haul optical transmission, and a maker of the tunable lasers that fiber networks depended on, each deal worth billions of dollars, each one paid for largely with paper, with shares of a stock that seemed to only go up. The logic was simple and, for a while, brutally effective. Every acquisition made Nortel's story bigger and more exciting to investors, which pushed the stock higher, which made the next acquisition, however expensive on paper, essentially free. By the summer of 2000, the company employed roughly 94,000 people worldwide. Its market value had climbed past 360 billion Canadian dollars, and it stood as the 9th most valuable corporation on the entire planet. Nortel was no longer a phone company. It was, for one summer, close to being the Canadian economy itself. But buying the future was only half the strategy, and the other half is the part almost nobody outside the telecom industry ever hears about. Nortel was not just selling routers and fiber optic gear to established phone companies with decades of paying customers behind them. A wave of brand new startup carriers was racing to build competing networks from scratch, companies with ambitious names and almost no revenue, and every one of them needed to buy expensive equipment before they had a single paying customer of their own. So Nortel started lending them the money to buy Nortel's own equipment. Billions of dollars in financing, much of it offered on easy terms, tied directly to future purchases, flowed out to these young carriers so they could install Nortel's gear today and, in theory, pay for it once their own business finally took off. Nortel was not alone in this. Its two biggest rivals in networking equipment were doing exactly the same thing to exactly the same customers, which meant an entire industry was quietly betting its future on companies that, in many cases, had never turned a profit in their history. For Nortel's own books, it was elegant. Every loan financed a sale. Every sale counted as revenue. Every quarter of rising revenue pushed the stock higher, and a higher stock made the next acquisition and the next round of financing easier still. It was not fraud, not yet. It was simply a company betting its own growth on the growth of customers who, in many cases, had no real business behind them yet at all. And in November of 2000, with warning signs already showing in the broader market, John Roth stood in front of investors and confidently predicted 30 to 35% revenue growth for the following year. Here's the part of the story that explains everything that happened afterward. The strategy that had made Nortel the single largest company in Canada was, structurally, the same strategy that would destroy it. When a company grows by lending money to its own customers so they can buy its own product, its fortunes stop being tied to how good that product actually is and become tied entirely to whether those customers can ever pay the money back. Nortel had made itself financially inseparable from a whole generation of unproven startup carriers, and none of the reserves it had set aside, none of the acquisitions it had made, none of the record-breaking market value it had reached changed the fact that all of it rested on customers whose own survival was never guaranteed in the first place. The company had not built an economy-proof business. It had built one enormous interconnected bet, where the health of the lender and the health of the borrower were, in practice, the same number wearing two different names, and every piece of it depended on every other piece, continuing to grow at exactly the pace John Roth had just promised investors it would. This is the part most people outside Canada have genuinely never heard. So if you want to see exactly how a bet this size unravels, stay with me, because it happened faster than almost anyone expected. Through 2001, the bet came apart all at once. The flood of capital that had been funding those young carriers dried up almost overnight as investors lost their appetite for unproven telecom startups, and without fresh money, dozens of Nortel's own financed customers simply could not pay for the equipment they had already installed, and many collapsed entirely, some within months of signing their financing deals. Nortel had no choice but to admit what those relationships were actually worth. Between April and June of 2001 alone, the company wrote down more than $12 billion in the value of the very acquisitions it had made 2 years earlier at the top of the market, the companies it had bought with soaring stock that had since fallen back to earth. The stock itself, which had traded near $122 in September of 2000, was down to $7.80 by September of 2001. By the end of that year, the company posted a full-year net loss of $27.3 billion, the largest corporate loss in Canadian history at the time, a number so large it was difficult for most people to picture, roughly equal to writing off the entire value of the company at its peak twice over. Between 2001 and 2002, Nortel cut its workforce from roughly 94,500 employees down to about 35,000, more than 60,000 jobs gone in under 2 years. On November 1st, 2001, John Roth stepped down as chief executive, leaving with a compensation package estimated at $139 million, an exit that struck many laid-off employees as its own kind of quiet insult. By June of 2002, the stock that had once closed at $124 was trading for less than $3, a decline of more than 99% from its peak. What happened next made a bad story worse. In 2003, with the company finally clawing its way back to a modest profit, several senior executives stood to receive large bonuses tied specifically to returning Nortel to profitability. Regulators later alleged that some of those same executives manipulated financial reserves to help the numbers cross exactly the thresholds their bonuses depended on. In November 2003, Nortel restated nearly $950 million in liabilities. By March 2004, the stock was crashing again as the company delayed its audited financial statements and warned of further restatements to come. And on April 28, 2004, the chief executive and chief financial officer were both fired, along with the company's controller. A former United States admiral took over as chief executive to steady the ship, and Canadian police spent 4 years investigating before formally charging all 3 former executives with fraud in June 2008. Nearly a decade after the firings, in January 2013, an Ontario court acquitted every one of them of the criminal charges, ruling their conduct had been mistakes rather than deliberate fraud. By then, a third chief executive, a former Motorola executive, had taken the job, eventually settling shareholder lawsuits for roughly $2.4 billion, before finally, on January 14, 2009, he filed for bankruptcy protection simultaneously in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. A company that 9 years earlier had been worth more than a third of its own country, now unable to pay its bills. What happened after the bankruptcy is the strangest twist in the entire story. Nortel did not get rescued or restructured. It was carved apart, piece by piece, and sold off to the highest bidders. Its wireless division to Ericsson, its office phone systems to Avaya, its fiber optic networking business to Ciena. Each sale a quiet admission that the whole had become worth less than the sum of its parts. But the very last thing Nortel had left to sell turned out to be worth more than almost anyone expected. In 2011, the company auctioned off its remaining patents, roughly 6,000 of them. Decades of engineering work with no factories, no employees, and no products attached to them anymore. Nothing but ideas on paper. Google opened the bidding at $900 million. After several rounds, a rival consortium of tech giants won the entire portfolio for $4.5 billion, 5 times Google's opening offer, and more money than Google had been willing to pay for everything else Nortel had left combined. All of the money raised across every one of those sales, roughly $7 billion in total, then sat frozen for years, while lawyers in 3 countries argued over who deserved to be paid first, the bondholders, the pension plans, or the disabled former employees whose benefits had been cut off the moment the bankruptcy began. A fight that dragged on for the better part of a decade before it was finally settled. The company that once could not pay its own bills had, in the end, nothing of real value left except the proof of what its own engineers had once been capable of inventing. It is tempting to file Nortel away as just another dot-com casualty or just another accounting scandal, but neither label really explains it. Nortel did not fail because nobody wanted what it built, and it did not fail only because a handful of executives cut corners years after the real damage was done. It failed because it tied its own survival to the survival of customers who had never proven they could survive on their own, and it did that so successfully, so completely, that for one summer it became larger than the rest of its own country's stock market combined. Scale had never looked so much like safety. It never had been. Nortel is not the only company from that same era we have covered on this channel. If you want to see what the exact same bubble did to an internet giant that traded its own inflated stock for something real, our video on AOL is right there waiting for you. And if boardroom collapses are more your speed, our Enron video from the same collapse years goes even deeper. Subscribe for more of these, and let us know in the comments, did you or anyone in your family ever own Nortel stock?